Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lunch and Learn. Let's Get Certified Associate Cloud Engineer. This is the first in a series of new Lunch and Learns that we're doing, focused around getting certified in various different exams, a bunch of the Google Cloud exams, also some of the CNCF exams as well. So please do have a look around the website, and you'll find all of our free Lunch and Learns coming up and the rest of our free sessions. But thank you for joining. Hopefully, we're going to have a really good hour session talking about this exam in particular, about our experience of it, and giving you some good tips to help you in your own endeavors to acquire this certification. Before we get started, just to introduce us, my name is Tim Berry. I'm the practice lead for cloud training here at Codia. So I've been with the company nearly 4 years, but my background as an engineer goes back over 20 years. But I've been working on Google Cloud specifically since about 2008, just sort of playing around with the App Engine when that launched. And I moved into more sort of training and enablement and developer advocacy about 5 or 6 years ago. And as I said, for the last 4 years, I've been running our training business here. And with me, I have my good buddy Ferris. Ferris, do you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tim. My name is Ferris. And at Codia, I am a principal platform engineer as well as a cloud trainer as well. My background, I was a career changer. I've been in the industry for 12, probably coming up 13 years. Background is sort of a Linux sysadmin, and it was round about probably 2016 when I first was introduced to the wonderful world of automation, DevOps, and Google Cloud as well. And this was my first Google Cloud exam as well. So it holds a nice place in my heart, and I'm really excited to speak about it and answer any questions with everyone today.
Awesome. Thanks, Ferris. So I should say, I think between the two of us, we've probably taken and recertified this specific exam probably 5 or 6 times between the two of us. I meant to check my CertMetrics account and completely forgot. But we, as people in the industry, we have to keep these things up to date, particularly as trainers. So this one, I actually just recertified on it yesterday. So hopefully I could tell you all about it within the confines of the NDA, obviously. Now we do have some stuff to show you. We're going to walk through the exam guide, and then we're going to talk about kind of our best practices and our tips and tricks, if you like, to help you prepare for the exam and to help you to pass the exam. But we've also got a big chunk of time carved out in this hour for your questions. So that's kind of the key thing with these Lunch and Learns. If you do have any questions, please do use the questions button. You should be able to see it on the left side of your screen there. Just pop your questions in there, and later on in the session, Ferris and I will do our best to answer them. Let's jump in. So let's talk about actually what this exam is, what the certification is. So Google obviously offer a bunch of different certifications now. Associate Cloud Engineer is currently, for the time being, the only associate level certification. So you have the foundation level cert of the Cloud Digital Leader, then you have the associate level cert of Associate Cloud Engineer, and then you have lots of different professional level certs, things like Cloud Architect, Data Engineer, Machine Learning Engineer, DevOps, Database, you name it, there's a pro level cert for it. This is all about to change actually though, because right now in beta there is a new associate level data exam. That's currently in beta. It's a public beta, I believe, so you can try that one out, and I suspect that will come into sort of general availability in the next few months. But other than that, beta exam, as of right now, and for a long time, this has been the only associate level exam. If you want to compare this to other cloud vendors, I would say this is sort of targeted around about the sort of level of the Solutions Architect Associate level exam for AWS. I can't tell you where it sits in terms of Azure exams because I've never looked at any of them, I'm afraid, so I couldn't tell you. But that's kind of where it sits in comparison to AWS. And as you can see, this is taken straight off Google's website. An associate cloud engineer deploys and secures applications, services, and infrastructure, monitors operations of multiple projects, and maintains enterprise solutions to ensure that they meet target performance metrics. I mean, most of the Google certs are pretty much based around specific job roles. So an associate cloud engineer, I guess, would be if your job role isn't specifically called cloud engineer, this could also be platform engineer, DevOps engineer to a certain extent, although obviously there is a professional level DevOps engineer certification as well. But really anyone who is kind of operating on the cloud, not necessarily architecting, because again, there is a separate professional level certification for cloud architecture, and we'll talk about that a bit later as well. But so it's really kind of the more sort of operational things that Google are looking for you to know how to do to pass this exam. Would you agree with that, Ferris? Where do you think this sits kind of in the range of?
I think that's that's absolutely right. It's day-to-day operations. It's certainly not so much as the decision making. You certainly, to a degree, need to know enough about how everything works, obviously, but not as much as a strategic or from a business customer point. This is certainly day-to-day and hands-on keyboards engineering for sure. It's a really nice. I won't get excited and tell too much straight away, but it's a really nice exam that validates those skills.
Awesome. So one thing we get asked a lot, obviously, in the training business, and Codia is primarily actually an engineering company, so obviously you have hundreds of people here who have certs. And a question that comes up every now and again is, why get certified? And there's some interesting statistics here, and you can check out the sources. The links are there for the sources for these. But in terms of making people feel more confident in their skills, kind of providing a way for people to show, reputationally that they do have those skills. I think that's why certifications are important. I think there's always a kind of debate around, what's more important, certificates or, real world experience or maybe projects. I've seen this. I put a post on LinkedIn a while ago about why I think certificates are still important, certifications, and that sparked a bit of a debate. And a lot of people think that they're not as important. My personal opinion is I think they are still a really good measure of skills. Basically because yes, it would be great if everyone who is in the market and wants to prove themselves could go out and build a full stack application and put all the source code in their GitHub and show off all their skills that way. But that's not very accessible for everyone to be able to do. Not everyone has the time or even the money to invest in building that sort of stuff. And certificates are still and certifications are still a good way of proving that you do have skills. I think there's a fair argument in that, some types of certification are maybe more valuable than others. Certainly performance-based certifications, which we'll get onto in some later sessions we're doing later in the year and next year. Things like the CKA and CCAD, for example. I think they probably do have slightly higher value than the general cloud certifications, which tend to be multiple choice. The last thing I'll say on this as well is that, as a hiring manager, I've hired engineers for a long, long time as well. And I'll always look at certifications because obviously you look at skills and experience and you talk to people and get to know them. But if people do have these certifications, it's a good yardstick as well. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Ferris.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think we probably share a fairly similar view on certifications. I know lots of very experienced engineers that don't get certified for reasons of, it's time. Burnout is a thing as well, and that sort of thing. But I personally, it's validation. It validates my skills personally to me, and I really like. It's showcasing to myself that I know what I'm talking about, and even with multiple question ones like the Google ones and the performance-based ones, like you mentioned, they might hold more weight because it's also a completely different exam almost, because there's the I wouldn't say intensity, but there's certainly the pressure of sort of doing it right on the day. Not to say there isn't any pressure with these types of exams, because you've still got to know your stuff. But personally, to me, like you reminded me about you did your engineer one yesterday. My DevOps one is coming up at the end next month, I think, and that to me was a real standout sort of validation of DevOps skills because I was working on a project which used a lot of cloud build, a lot of GKE, getting started with Kubernetes as well. So for me, that was a real good test, especially with sort of SLIs, SLAs. Again, we might have to do another one of those for the DevOps one, maybe, because I really like that exam, and I'm doing it next month. So that might be a good excuse for another webinar. But again, I personally hold them, and I've interviewed engineers that have sort of a varies of certs as well. And I think it's almost a conversation starter because you kind of know what somebody's almost gone through, like, and you can sort of pick from experience on somebody's CV maybe, and you can almost sort of place it when they've done an exam that they validated those skills almost. And I almost is a bit like a conversation starter potentially, but there's always going to be differing opinions. But
Yeah.
I personally think they're a very, very good validation of testing your skills. Personally, I would say.
Yeah, I don't actually know how they compare to some of the other kind of cloud, the AWS or Azure certs, but I know.
Yeah, I've not done one yet.
Well, that's it. But I've been doing the Google ones for so long now, and I can say that they are, the questions are kind of scenario and experience based. It's not a question of, I don't think you could just memorize the product lists and the features of each product and know how to pass these exams. I think you do have to know, even though you're not actually practically doing it, you still, I don't think you can pass one of these exams without knowing, without showing that you have done this stuff in real life to a certain extent. It's interesting, like I said, my exam history, other than Google exams, obviously the CNCF exams, which are performance based, and historically, going way back to things like the Red Hat exams. Now they were, they were really hard because you're in a room with physical infrastructure, and at the end of the exam, the examiner comes around and turns everything off, and when he turns it back on, it has to work, or you fail the exam. So, but that's probably not practical to do something like that for a Google exam.
Maybe not. I think this makes I remember those you telling me that a while ago, but I think this makes these exams almost a little bit more approachable as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Potentially, it takes that sort of added element of stress of will it all turn on after it's been rebooted.
I do enjoy a performance exam, though. I have to say, I do enjoy a performance exam.
I've done two of the Kubernetes ones this year, and it is maybe I enjoyed them more because I passed them. But but I have the very first exam I ever took was it was one of the MCSA ones, one of the Microsoft ones, and they were very wordy. Like there was almost sort of like a paragraph of just Billy and Tommy work in a garage with mom and pop, and they need to do an AD server. And then by the time you've sort of read through a chapter of sort of character building, you then say, how does he create a terminal server? And I'm exhausted already reading them. So I think at least the Google ones are quite well written, in my opinion. So.
Is there a clue in their character background as to how I create this terminal server?
Exactly. Yeah. Was it Mrs. Purple in the with a candlestick in the front room, maybe?
Yeah, no, I mean the questions, the Google questions do tend to be much more specific. Sometimes there is context. Obviously, they are scenarios, but it's there because it's the criteria that you need to answer that question. But we'll actually get onto that in a second in terms of how the questions tend to be constructed. So let's talk a little bit about the exam itself. So it is a 2-hour exam. I personally, I don't think you'll need 2 hours to complete the exam. So it feels like a very comfortable amount of time. You certainly don't need to panic in terms of, rushing through it or anything. It's available in multiple languages. It costs $125 to take the exam. One thing we get asked a lot actually is about kind of, how you can get vouchers and things for maybe discounts for this sort of thing. So it's worth noting that, once you have passed the exam and you're looking to recertify 3 years later, because it is valid for 3 years from the date of your certification, you'll get a 50% voucher from Google when you want to recertify. The different versions of the exams, the number of questions has gone up and down. It is currently a 50-question exam, and they are all multiple choice. Occasionally you get, in all Google exams, you might get some multiple select, so pick 2 out of these 5 options, that sort of thing. But most of the time they are just multiple choice questions. And you can do these exams in person. There are supported testing centers all over the place. More and more these days, certainly thanks to lockdown a couple of years ago, a few years ago now, people do these exams online. And I'll talk a bit more about kind of the how that works in a moment. In terms of prereqs, there are no prereqs to do the exam. You don't have to have an existing certificate in anything else. And Google recommend that you have about 6 months experience, hands-on experience with Google Cloud. Now, in practice, this is going to depend on you as a learner. It might be that you can take yourself through a lot of the online learning very quickly and very quickly learn this stuff and get up to speed because you happen to have an aptitude for it. Different people learn at different rates and in different ways, and it might take you a bit longer. You might need that good 6 months of just playing around with it. It'll come down to things as well, like how much time you can actually spare for learning. Obviously, all of us have different schedules and busy lives. Typically, looking through the exam guide, and I'll talk about that in a moment, about how to prepare for the exam, you'll get a good feeling from that and from using the practice exam questions on Google's website of when you will probably feel confident that you are ready to take the exam. So in terms of actually taking the exam, like I said, it is a multiple choice exam. There's some good tips I always give people in terms of these sorts of exams. So the exam interface itself is very easy to use. If you're doing this, either if you're doing this in person or online, it's the same interface. It'll be on your computer or on a computer in the exam center you go to. And it's a kind of lockdown browser, essentially. You can only see the exam interface and nothing else. So nice and distraction-free. The exam interface just contains the questions and answers for you to select from. There are no case studies in this exam, as there are in the Professional Cloud Architect exam, for example. And the exam interface lets you see every question and move back and forth through the questions through the whole exam as many times as you like before you submit your answers. So it may sound obvious, but take your time, read the question, look at every possible answer very carefully. You can mark questions for review. Now, when you look at the potential answers, it's probably going to look like there's at least more than one potentially correct answer. And the trick I always try and use is to look for that qualifying criteria in the question. And if you look at the different things in the scenario, the things, only relevant information is going to be in that question. Those criteria are going to help you to discard answers with a process of elimination until you have found it might not look like 100% the correct answer, but it's going to be the most correct out of those options. And as a general rule, Google tends to prefer simple solutions, managed services. So even if there are multiple options there that could be correct, just keep it simple. And like I said, in terms of managed services, many questions will ask you things like, to follow Google best practices, and Google's best practices or recommended solutions are usually to keep things simple and use managed services. Is that sort of your approach as well, would you say, Ferris?
Absolutely, especially with the most correct or most true of the answers you can discard. There's going to be maybe something fairly obvious that's not going to be right. And keywords, I think that's an important thing. So I try and people ask me about sort of taking these searches. Then the questions aren't written in a tricky way. It's not trying to trip you up. It is trying to give you the right words, and it's just finding those keywords. And I think that's where, again, it sounds super obvious. Even stuff we get sort of taught at school when we do exams is read every question, but it's really easy to just glance over some and just miss out something really obvious, which is going to be something down to whether it's going to be a particular location or a particular sort of requirement or something that you've been asked to do. And that's why, reading every question and reading the answers as well, I find it is, because that will help you find the most true. Like I said, I'm an actual engineer. I'm doing engineering at the moment still. And the exams are this exam is very much from an engineering sort of point of view. There's no, and from an engineer, we all want simple lives, so we tend to keep to the most sort of simplest solutions and keep it simple, and of course following best practices. So again, the exams are certainly written in that way from a cloud engineering point of view, for sure.
Yeah. And it's like I put on the slide there, reinventing the wheel is probably never the correct answer. So even if some of the answers may look like, yeah, I mean, that would work, is it the best way to do it? Does it, is it overcomplicated?
It might be the most fun, but it's
yeah,
it's certainly not going to score you a point in the engineering world, maybe, or in the exam world.
Yeah. Is it creating technical debt for the future as well? But you're right, like you said, I think there's a tendency. I certainly find when I first sit down to do one of these exams and I'm on question 1 of 50 or 1 of 60, and there's a lot of text, and I I get bored very quickly, and I'm like, can I just skim read these? But you've got to stop yourself. If you skim read it, you're going to miss that vital clue, because you might skim read the question, and then in the answers, you'll immediately discount things that you think are not technically viable, and you'll pick one, and you'll have missed something in the question, like actually they want something serverless, or they don't want something server. It could go either way, but if you miss that criteria, you've picked the wrong answer then.
Yeah. And even as fairly seasoned as we are with taking these, and we'll get to another point later on where go through the questions again, even now, and I'll probably do it next month when I retake my DevOps, is I'll go review the questions and realize when I reread the question again that I've completely taken the wrong either context or not read it properly the first time, and actually have to change my answer. It does happen. So it's, I think, those first 3 are really, really key.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is kind of the approach that I take. Now, like I said, you've got 2 hours. That's a long period of time. It's plenty of time to have a good long read, a thorough read of all the questions and answers. Take a first pass through, answer everything you can. Well, answer every question, but basically kind of mark the questions that you're not 100% sure of the first time you go around. And after your first pass, you can review all of your answers. So the exam interface will show you kind of 1 to 50, and with a little asterisk next to all the ones that you've marked. You can go back through. You can look over your marked questions, and then unmark them once you're happy with those. And then you'll normally have time to do even a third pass through. And I think, like you said, Ferris, that's when, for me anyway, on a third pass, I might think like, I'm confident with all this now. I'm ready to submit. I go through my third pass around, and there'll be 1 or 2 I think, oh, actually, do you know what? No, that's wrong. I've got that wrong, and I'm gonna change it. And it might feel like
you just spot one of those key words that you missed the first time round. It does happen. Especially maybe towards the end as well, when you're feeling maybe a bit tired. Because you've been reading for a while. But then as you go around, and I always find when I'm doing a second or a third pass, and like you said, with the time, you do get plenty of time. You feel a little bit more relaxed and confident because you can see the clock. You've gone through the questions at least. So you might, especially with the flagged ones, maybe take a little bit longer because you can see you've got time. But that's me answering everything, because even if you give it a guess, you give yourself more of a chance of getting something or even partially correct than if you just leave it blank.
Exactly. I think that's a good point. Like, I think once you've done the first pass and you've got plenty of time left, you kind of can relax a little bit, take a breath, and then focus on the second and third rounds through, giving it a bit more attention. But it's worth using the time. There's no extra marks for finishing early.
You don't get an extra big medal for finishing early.
You don't know. And it's it's worth making the effort, right? Because otherwise you've got to wait to redo it. There are kind of incremental increases in how long you have to wait. I don't have the information in front of me, but I believe you can rebook an attempt.
I think you have to wait 30 days for the first attempt. I think then it's
3 months. I think
3 to 6 months for the. I think it's 3 months for the second time, and then third time you're waiting a year, I believe.
Yeah, it does go up and up. So it's worth making the effort. There is plenty of time to do it. Bear in mind, though, that in terms of time, you cannot take breaks. That's not allowed. You cannot leave the room. Once the exam starts, you can't move away from your computer until you've submitted your final answers and you've left that exam environment. So a couple of other things that are really important to note is make sure you've had a good breakfast or a lunch or whenever you're you're doing the exam. Make sure you've had a good night's sleep. Simple things like that. Make sure you're hydrated, not too well hydrated, because you can't take a break, halfway through the exam. Um, and I just want to talk quickly about, the requirements and conditions for remote testing. I've done a bunch of exams remotely now with remote proctoring, and I'm kind of used to it now, but it is a little bit weird the first time you do it if you're not used to it. If there is a physical exam center, down the road from you, that might be an easier option. You rock up, they've got it all ready for you. You go in, you do your exam, you walk out again. Um, but as I said, most people these days are taking these tests remotely. Now, to do this, you'll have to make sure that your computer meets the system requirements that are on the Web Assessor website when you book the exam. I'm pretty sure most versions of Mac and Windows are supported. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure Linux won't be supported, which is a shame. It's more of a shame, actually, you can't do the Linux Foundation exams on a Linux laptop, but that's a subject for a future webinar. There are system checks and things you can run through to make sure that your system is supported. And some of the requirements are that basically you will need a functioning webcam and a microphone so that they can see and hear you as you're doing the exam. You're only allowed to use a single screen. So if that's a laptop screen, that's absolutely fine. If you prefer to use an external monitor like I do, then your laptop screen needs to be shut. You can only have one monitor on. And basically, you will have a check-in process where they confirm that your environment that you're in meets their requirements. So this means that the room that you're in needs to be relatively free of clutter, distractions. It is a closed book exam, so you can't have any printed materials or anything near you. And the person who checks you in for your exam will take you through a process to check that your environment is suitable. Now, this has varied for me quite a bit. I've had sort of 2 or 3 different experiences of remote proctoring in terms of the check-in process. The kind of easiest one I've had so far has actually pointed me to just use my phone to go to a website, take some pictures of my room on my phone, which obviously it uses some sort of image AI model to look at, and it says, yep, you're all good, carry on. I've only done that once. Most of the time, it is a human on the other end asking me to show them around the room with the webcam. So that means picking up my webcam, pointing it at all of the walls in the room, holding there for a few seconds so they can check. And they're just looking to make sure that there's no one in the room who's going to be helping you. You haven't got any written notes. You haven't printed out a cheat sheet and sellotaped it to the underside of your desk or anything like that. So you'll have to show them around the room. That was my experience yesterday. I've also had the experience where you do all that plus some other things, show them the floor, the ceiling, under the desk, under my keyboard, under a mouse pad. And even so far as sometimes I've had to show them my wrists to make sure I'm not wearing a smartwatch that I might use to cheat. I have to show them in my ears, not too close, but to show them that that I'm not being fed information by anyone through AirPods or anything like that. And sometimes as well, I have to take my glasses off and show them up close that I'm not wearing any kind of augmented reality glasses. And it's just, like I said, it's a bit of a weird thing if that happens to you the first time, and it feels a bit sort of invasive, but once you get used to it, it is absolutely fine. And the final tip I'll give you as well is I have been tripped up once by registering for an exam with the short version of my name. I'm Tim. I've always been Tim, but it doesn't say Tim on my passport. And so I actually got stopped from doing an exam once because they said, well, that's not your name. That's someone else's name. Who's that going to be? My twin? I don't know. But anyway, make sure that you register for the exam with the name exactly as it's shown on your official government ID. Anything you want to add to that, Ferris? Any interesting experiences you've had with remote proctoring?
No, I'd say I've always been in a fairly clear room. I can't do it in my usual super nerdy games room with all my video game stuff all over the wall and kids' toys. So I usually pick a fairly quiet and plainish sort of room of the house. I've done it in the exam centre as well. But the exam centre for me it's like an hour and a half drive. It's the closest one, or it's an hour on the train. I guess what I really like is if you've maybe been putting off doing an exam for a while because you don't think you're quite ready. And I've done this with one in the past where I'm feeling quite confident in the morning, and I've gone to have a look, and there's literally a slot in the afternoon, and I've just done one that afternoon.
Wow.
So the online proctoring is really handy for that, because sort of you do it while your tail's up a little bit, while you're sort of feeling quite confident.
I don't think I could do that. That takes guts to do that.
Yeah. Well, I've done it twice, and I've got a 50% pass mark on them. So, but yeah, I could say I've had to do the whole like show me your sort of glasses stance, and in others it's been fairly sort of, yeah, you're good. I think the main thing is yeah, make sure you sort of clear nothing on your walls and no other electronics on your desk as well. And I'll make you show you where, like, because they might ask you to use your phone to sort of use the camera to mirror the thing behind you. And then they'll want to carry your laptop to show you where you put it in that. That's about as, I haven't had anything overly interesting really. Otherwise, I can't say I've had anything where I've stopped doing an exam like you have. So I've nothing quite like that.
I mean, I got nothing on my walls. I mean, obviously I've got a virtual background on right now. There's a fair bit of shelf clutter, but they don't seem to mind that. They did ask me to confirm that my printer was turned off at one point. I mean, it's obviously turned off. It doesn't work. It's a printer. I think the only other kind of thing I've ever been picked up on, and actually this is a long time ago, it may have been another Red Hat exam, but it was remote proctored, was I apparently did a thing where when I was trying to think through a problem, I would go, and covering my mouth, they were thinking, he's talking to someone. So they said they stopped my exam and they went, stop covering your mouth. But then they resumed the exam. But it's little things like that, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, that reminds me. I did get a message saying, stop talking to yourself. Because I tend to mutter myself and sort of read out loud to make it, I don't know, stick in my head a little bit. Because I was reading the question through just sort of like quite quietly. And they were like, you know, because maybe it sounded like I was talking to somebody, maybe like reading the question out to somebody and hopefully getting an answer. But they say, please, can you stop talking to yourself? So, sorry, don't know I'm doing it. But that's about it. That's right about, and I try really hard not to do it.
They're normally fairly reasonable because they are just humans on the other end of it. Yeah, I mean, I actually got some good advice for one.
Quite friendly.
Because another thing I think most people do when we're thinking about things is we tend to sort of look up and off into the distance, and that might indicate that we're looking at that secret piece of paper. And so again, what this guy said to me was, you know, if you need to think about a question, just shut your eyes. It's good to rest your eyes anyway. Otherwise, you're staring at a white screen for 2 hours. So just close your eyes if you need to think of an answer to a question. Cool. So moving along, we're going to go through some of the sections of the exam guide. So all of this is available on the Google Cloud website on the details of the exam. We're going to talk about kind of some of the sections, the knowledge domains, the learning objectives, and just give you a bit of our kind of opinion on what sort of things you should be looking to learn to cover those off. And just to repeat again, you know, if anyone does have any questions, that's what we're here for. So please do pop questions into the Q&A. We've got some questions that were submitted before as well we can go through as well. But as I go through these exam sections, as I said, if you've got any questions, just chuck them in the Q&A section there and we'll try and answer them. You might want to take notes as well. Generally, what I recommend people do is refer to the exam guide and come up with a red, amber, green list. So in terms of your learning, look at all these sections, and it's green if you know it. There's no problems. You can answer questions on it. It's amber if you're a bit patchy on it, and it's red if you've no clue. And that's really going to help you to prioritize what it is that you need to learn in order to pass the exam. So section 1, and actually Google recently have now added weightings to these sections, which is really nice. So we know kind of how much importance each section carries, although they are all roughly the same. But this first one is 20% of the questions in the exam. We have 2 subsections within section 1. But section 1 is setting up a cloud environment. So in this first subsection, it's all about setting up projects and accounts. So you're going to need to have a good grasp of the resource hierarchy in Google Cloud. Things like knowing that the organizational node is at the top. Your resources are organized likely from there into folders, and then below folders into projects. And then obviously in the projects where you have your actual cloud resources. And you need to think about, why we do that. Why do we have things in folders? Do we map folders to departments, for example? Is it because that's a good place to put security policies or organizational policies? So you need to know, understand things like how to grant IAM roles. Do we grant them to individuals or groups? What's the best practice there, for example? How we grant them to service accounts, how we do this manually or with automated tooling, how we enable APIs on a project level, for example. That's pretty much. I think they have taken out a bit more of the uh, operation suite stuff that was in section 1 historically. That doesn't seem to be so much in the exam guide anymore. It's obviously still worth knowing about, though. And the next subsection is around billing. Surprisingly, a fair amount of the Associate Cloud Engineer exam is around billing. Obviously, it's very important to control how people are able to spend money in the cloud. So you need to understand some billing fundamentals. From the perspective of a business owner, how would you set things up so that you are dealing with either a single or multiple billing accounts? How would you link them to the right projects? You think about things like budgets and alerts. How would you export or maybe analyze your spending reports as well, so you can keep a good eye on that? In our next section, planning and configuring a cloud solution. This makes up 17.5% of the exam, so slightly less than section 1. So here's where we kind of dive a bit more into the technical side of things. So we're not talking about billing anymore, but we're talking about things like infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and other computing models. And this is where there's a little bit of an overlap with kind of more architecture type questions, but associate cloud engineers need to understand the trade-offs of these different models as well. When is it beneficial to do things in a virtual machine, such as if you're migrating from on-prem, if you need complete control, for example. When is GKE the right way to go? So I would say, when you've got containerized workloads, but you still need lots of control, but you want the platform to help with some management. Obviously, Google is massively pushing GKE autopilot now as well. So you need to think about if a scenario involves having, no responsibilities over infrastructure whatsoever, but still using Kubernetes. So maybe that's a job for autopilot. But you also need to think about, when is Cloud Run the right way to go? Is it a simple web app? Is it a simple container? Is it stateless, for example? Or when Cloud Functions is the right way to go? And that's usually down to whether or not this is an event-driven workflow. Have in the back of your head things like when preemptible or spot VMs might be right, like for a fault-tolerant workload, and think about kind of how you can use things like the right sizing recommendations for Compute Engine. I should say as well, Ferris, jump in as well if you've got any points on these. Don't worry if you haven't, I can rattle through them. But if you can think of anything I'm missing on these.
No, I think you're doing a good job, and I think this is where, from an engineer, I'm listening to you think on my day to day. I think yes, simplicity is where it's at, especially with these questions as well. So and Google's best practice as well, especially with IAM as well, it's very important to follow. Yeah. So yeah, no, I think you're doing a very good job so far explaining the sections.
I'll pay you later, thanks. So the next subsection in this section is planning and configuring data storage options. So again, this is where it might seem more like a cloud architect question or even a data engineering question. But a platform engineer, an associate cloud engineer, still needs to know roughly what these things are for, when what the use case is for using these. You don't need to know how to go and build them and optimize them, but you still need to know which one to choose in different use cases. So a good kind of rule of thumb, and there are really good kind of flow charts for the stuff on Google's website. But do you have relational data? Is it transactional data? Are you looking for an SQL database? You've got two options: Cloud SQL, cheaper but not as powerful; Cloud Spanner, more powerful, more money. Usually the criteria between these two it comes down to things like scalability and kind of geographic availability. So if you're familiar with these products at all, Cloud SQL is basically a managed service for some off-the-shelf database services, MySQL, Postgres, and Microsoft SQL Server. It's a fantastic service, but it has a kind of limitation in terms of its availability. It can go up to a regional level of availability, and you can scale it in terms of adding read replicas. Now, if you need global availability, and you really want to have that massive sort of worldwide scale of both reads and writes, that's when you're going to be looking at Cloud Spanner. In terms of our other options here, so we need to know enough about Firestore to know when it's a good fit. Firestore is generally Google's recommendation for things like mobile or web document-based database needs. It's kind of similar to MongoDB if you've ever used that. So it's basically a document NoSQL database. And then you need to know when you would use Bigtable, and it's typically for big data scenarios, Internet of Things, tons of data coming in, maybe changing fast, anything time series, ad tech, or financial modeling. That's when we're going to be using Bigtable. Cloud storage is, in my opinion, a bit more obvious to know when we're going to use cloud storage. We need to think about, any kind of object storage use cases, any unstructured data. It's good to know how cloud storage works in terms of things like object versioning, its lifecycle management rules, and you may still get questions on the different storage classes, even though now obviously we do have auto class as well. There are also different storage options for virtual machines, so you need to know the difference between the different types of persistent disks, and when you would pick those. Moving on, then we need to know a little bit about some of the network resources. So load balancers. Now, you won't get as many questions on load balancing in this exam as you will, for example, in the professional cloud architect. You still need to kind of know roughly what they're for and when you would use them. But again, it's not going to be probed in as much depth as in the professional cloud architect exam. Something that surprised me to see in the exam guide was the network service tiers concept. There are, believe it or not, 2 different network service tiers in Google Cloud. I've never known anyone to use anything other than the premium tier, because you're basically switching off a lot of features if you're using the standard tier, although obviously you do save a bunch of money. Moving on to section 3. So this is 25% of the exam now, deploying and implementing a cloud solution. So we need to think about how we interact with some of these services. We've done our designing stuff. How do we launch VMs? How do we assign them disks? How do we set up availability policies? How do we manage SSH keys, for example? Really important that you understand how managed instance groups work, why we use them, how we create templates, set up auto-scaling, for example. And there are also recent updates to the exam that now cover things like OS login, VM manager, OS config, for example, some of these new more advanced features for managing virtual machines and compute engine. For GKE, there is a fair amount of Kubernetes stuff in this exam and in the PCA now. Obviously, it's kind of a flagship product for Google. You don't need to be a GKE expert. This is not a Kubernetes exam, but have in the back of your head a couple of basic kubectl commands. Think about when you would use a standard cluster or an autopilot cluster in GKE, for example. Have a good sense of kind of how to get a simple app up and running in a Kubernetes cluster. Maybe if you're really unlucky, you might get some questions about sort of rolling updates and scaling, but I think those things normally come up more in the professional cloud architect exam. Moving on to serverless options, we're looking at Cloud Run and Cloud Functions. App Engine is still around, but I don't think it's been in any exam for a while now. Don't quote me on that, but it's not mentioned in the exam guide anymore. So again, it's just about knowing when to use run, when to use functions. I don't think the exam has caught up yet with Cloud Run functions, which is a new thing. So if the question scenario is around anything event-driven, so maybe responding to an event like a storage event or a PubSub event, that's probably going to be a Cloud Functions option. And in terms of Cloud Run, it's always fun to see references to Anthos in Google's documentation. They haven't quite updated it everywhere. Of course, Anthos is now called GKE Enterprise, so it's worth knowing the difference between Cloud Run, which is obviously a fully managed service that you just use, and Cloud Run for GKE Enterprise, which is essentially the same thing, but it's running on your GKE Enterprise clusters. More about data and storage in this section as well. Once you've picked the product, how do you actually get started using it? How do you load data into that storage solution that you've chosen? So you need to understand some of the different methods you might use. And there might be different multiple choice answers where you've got to pick the right version based on a requirement like a geography, for example. And then again, more networking in this section as well. So we need to understand how you set up a VPC, the difference between things like custom and auto mode networks. It's good to have an understanding of things like shared VPC, VPC peering, easy to say. You also need to understand things like how do you access Google APIs when you don't have an external IP address? How do you access things across a VPN or an interconnect that don't have an external IP address? So things like private service access, Google Private Access. Um, Again, not a huge amount, of detail at this level. More in the professional cloud architect on terms of things like firewall rules and best practices for setting up firewall rules. But still good to have the basics covered for the exam. And there will be mentions of infrastructure as code. And again, it's not a detailed exam. This isn't a Terraform exam, for example. But the exam it may ask you a couple of questions around these things. Now, it will call out Cloud Foundations. This is the Cloud Foundation Toolkit is Google's kind of approach to covering all of these different infrastructure as code options. I'm pretty sure Deployment Manager, which is Google's original kind of native approach to infrastructure as code, that's no longer in the exam guide at the moment, so it's very unlikely you'll get a question
on that. It's not mentioned anymore. It's still around, but it's certainly
we don't speak
anymore.
of
it. This should not be mentioned.
But as I say, the Foundation Toolkit, Terraform, these are kind of Google's best practices. But at this level of the exam, again, it's not about you're not going to get questions on how you use these things. It's just sort of when you would use them. It's interesting to see as well. So I think references to the marketplace have been removed, but we've now added a couple of things like Helm and the config connector. Now they're fairly advanced topics, but they're just things you kind of have to know about, roughly what they do and when you would use them. You're not going to get.
I think it's just that.
Yeah.
I remember getting some Terraform questions, but nothing to the point of fix this resource block of code or anything like that. It was certainly more of a what automation tool would you use here or something like that. It's
I mean, Helm is a very commonly used thing. It's, if you haven't heard of it, it's a way to package application manifests for Kubernetes. It's very popular, but like Ferris said, you're not going to get quizzed on how to use it. The config connector, I'm surprised to see in the exam guide. It's not something not something we've seen very often. But I guess perhaps its use is on the rise, which is why it's there. So that's worth looking into. And it's the config connector.
I think it's because they've.
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, I think it's because I think it's now announced that it works. It now is supported with autopilot.
Okay.
I think config connector. I need to revisit it, but I'm sure it's now working with that autopilot, which is the supported best practice way of deploying GK in Google's point of view. So that might be why. Potentially.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So that autopilot is the preferred method of deploying GK over standard GK now. But if autopilot supports config connector, but the config connector is basically a way to configure other Google Cloud resources, but as Kubernetes objects. So you're using the Kubernetes API to manage the rest of your Google Cloud resources. Moving on to section 4, we're now into operations. This is 20% of the exam. So things like, once we've deployed things, how do we stop or start things, change their configuration, delete them? How do we connect to them? How do we do backups? How do we create images from snapshots? How do we just generally manage these assets, basically? And so again, there's repetition in terms of, what different topics we're covering within each of these sections, just under a slightly different context. But now, as I said, we're in this operations context. So in terms of GKE, how do we observe what we've done in GKE? How do we modify things like node pools, pods, or services? And again, not an advanced Kubernetes exam. I don't think you'll get anything beyond the realm of simple things like pods and services. But you might get questions around, understanding the different requirements for stateful apps in GKE as opposed to stateless applications. How to manage auto-scaling. That includes horizontal auto-scaling of deployments, but also potentially vertical auto-scaling and cluster auto-scaling as well. And again, for Cloud Run, we don't get super deep into it, but you need to understand the major concepts of things like services, versions, configuring traffic splitting, and scaling. Remember, you can set hard limits on the number of instances that your Cloud Run service will scale to, but you can also set concurrency limits, which is how many requests a single container instance can handle. And then back to storage and database, of course. How do we do things like set up lifecycle policies for objects in cloud storage? You might get, I mean, in terms of things like BigQuery, you're not going to get quizzed on SQL statements. You might, though, as an associate cloud engineer, need to know what IAM role someone needs to perform a query on a BigQuery data set. Similarly, you might need to know IAM roles for people to have access to Cloud SQL to do backups or restores. So it's that kind of operational level of knowledge that you'll need, not a sort of deep technical knowledge of the actual storage technologies themselves.
It's almost like you've got to again. I'll pretend I'm an engineer. I've got a ticket from a data side who wants to maybe run a query. How would you facilitate that with IAM permissions and what have you? So yeah, it's certainly not a data engineer just so no one gets put off.
Definitely. And again, more kind of operations things. These are the sort of things you'd expect an associate cloud engineer to do, which is things like, making changes to VPCs, expanding the range of a subnet. I personally have always used tooling to help me with things like, there's a great command line tool called subnet calc. I cannot do subnet calculations in my head. I've worked with engineers who have. I'm happy for them, but not me. but you'll need some basic knowledge of how these things work, CIDR ranges, that sort of stuff, to answer some of these questions, and also have a familiarity with services like Cloud DNS and Cloud NAT. When it comes to monitoring and logging, you want to know how to create alerts, how notifications work, things like custom metrics when you would use them, configuring log exports, drilling down to a specific log. There's a fair amount of different things, different ways it could go here, because obviously it's quite a sort of comprehensive service. Although, you will probably, you may only get one or two questions on these topics, but you will need a fairly comprehensive knowledge of kind of monitoring and logging, because that is, that's a daily activity for anyone working as an associate cloud engineer. The final section of the exam, identity and security, or access and security. So this is another 17.5% of the marks. I think we've talked about some of this stuff already, but knowing how to look at the different IAM policies for various members in an organization, knowing the difference between basic, predefined, and custom roles. And again, in terms of best practices, Google always recommends the use of predefined or curated roles. These are the roles that Google manage for you. Basic roles are always going to be too broad in scope in terms of that principle of least privilege. Custom roles are great as outliers, but they're a headache to manage, and they do have some annoying restrictions as well. So understanding this and knowing that our kind of predefined granular roles specific to given job functions are the best practices way to do things will help you a lot with these questions. And finally, service accounts. Have a good working knowledge of what they're for, how you set them up. The kind of, again, going back to best practices, that your compute engine VMs, your workloads, these things should have their own identities, normally in the form of a service account, so that you can assign permissions and roles following that principle of least privilege. And again, a best practice being to use attached service accounts, so you're never actually dealing with custom keys that you're downloading and having to manage. But be aware of why that's a problem as well, and some of the ways that you can mitigate that. And that's all the objectives of the exam guide. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour there. Hopefully that is helpful if you are looking to kind of come up with a study plan. Yeah, I don't think, Ferris, I got a few questions I wanted to ask you about kind of your experiences of the exam. And again, I'll just encourage anyone on the call to use the questions box if you've got any questions on anything I've covered there. So when did you last renew your ACE exam, Ferris?
So I did it last year, end of August, September, I believe it was. Yeah, last year I redid it.
Okay, so it's a 3 year period. So you've got a while yet to
Yes,
yeah
I've got it for
before it
another couple of
again.
years now. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
so that's helpful actually, because obviously I've sort of done it, I guess, nearly in the middle of your renewal period. So
Yeah, I
hopefully
guess so.
you'll be able to run the next one of these webinars and tell us what's changed then. Um, and there was for like 5 minutes, it felt like there was an option to do. We were talking right at the beginning of the call, weren't we, about performance-based exams? There was a performance-based version at one point, wasn't there?
Yeah, it really caught my eye because I remember pinging it to you a while ago. Where if you wanted to recertify, um, they beta tested. I've not seen much more about it. I read about it, but there was an option to recertify by doing what seemed to me like a challenge lab. So
Mm.
anyone who's familiar with Cloud Skills Boost is if you really want to test your knowledge and you want a bit of inspiration on how do I practice, you can get a challenge lab which gives you a list of sort of tasks to do, but it doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't give you the answers how to do it. It will mark you on what you've done. But I think that's a really neat way to recertify this one, because things do change. Like some of the conversation you mentioned, that sort of app engine wasn't really mentioned in your exam that you took yesterday. It was still a fair bit of it last year, but certainly more towards Cloud Run. So naturally, as an engineer, within 3 years, you're gonna be shifting that way anyway. So I think a hands-on approach is a nice way of recertifying for sure. So I think it's a watch this space, and I've read a couple of blog posts where people have done it. They really enjoyed the experience because, performance, but it's a total change of pace. So yeah, I'm wondering to see when that actually comes through. But
It's an interesting
I've heard positive things.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea to have it specifically for a recertification. So,
Yeah,
as opposed to a first time cert, because I guess the other big difference with performance-based exams is they are typically open book. Obviously, if you're doing a challenge lab through Cloud Skills Boost, you have access to documentation, but then that that's as it should be, right? Because if it's not like you're doing your day job without access to documentation. Um, so yeah, hopefully, with a bit of luck, that will become a thing that is available. But I haven't heard anything else about that yet. So we've only got a few minutes left, but we did have a couple of questions submitted before the webinar that I just wanted to quickly go through. This is kind of our most frequently asked questions. Um, People always ask, what is the pass mark for the exam? And the answer is no one knows unless they work for Google in the specific department that create these exams. It's not something that Google publish. I mean, it's something. It's that we've no way of knowing it, so it's not something you should worry about. Other than I would say, when you are sitting the exam, when you're going through it, and you're going through, back and back through all the answers, and you're worrying about, have I got this right? Have I got that right? Just bear in mind that there is a buffer. I mean, whatever that buffer is, again, we don't know if it's, if the pass mark 70% or 80% or whatever, but that means you don't have to get every question right. That's okay. You'll still, in most cases, pass with a handful of questions wrong. So hopefully that takes the pressure off a bit. Another question we get is, do you get feedback on how you did on the exam? So at the end of the exam, when you submit the exam, it will say pass or fail in very small letters straight away. But your actual pass or fail is not confirmed by Google for a few days because
they
they
word it as provisional pass or fail.
exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's the word I was looking for when we were talking about this earlier on. Provisional.
And I think that they do spot checks for security and things like that, and the proctoring process, particularly with the online exams, before they confirm your grade, your pass fail grade via email within a few days.
I've never known any of mine or anyone I've spoken to have that change from the end of the exam to when they've had the email. But
Same here,
you
yeah.
know,
No, you can be fairly confident once you've got that provisional yes or no that it will stick. And if you are unlucky and you do fail the exam, another recent change is that in the email that you do receive, Google will provide some feedback on which sections of the exam that you were not successful in, which can be helpful. I think it's just that they just give you some weightings on, nothing really specific,
I
just some
think
weightings on that.
yeah, I think it's literally on those objectives that we just went through, and you'll get a kind of sort of score, so you can gauge how well or maybe not as well as you wanted to on those. I think that's literally within the last year or 10 months that's been around, so that's going to be quite handy
Yeah.
for if you weren't successful the first time.
There's a couple of other questions here that I think we already pretty much covered. Things like, yeah, how long does it take to know if you pass or fail? We talked about discounts and the best place to take the exam. There's two quick questions I'd like to finish with. So one is, can you recommend any practice exams on the internet? Do you want to take this one first? Because I would say no.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, no, that's basically it. It's not because the exams do get the questions get updated and they get changed every year, every 2 years, something like that. And because I know it's a multiple choice and you're reading questions, you're answering, it's not a memory game. It's not a memory test, really. It is, especially for the engineering, it's a hands-on exam. A lot of this stuff is you'll know by doing. So as a practice exam, no. Unless
It's more,
maybe I'm not looking hard enough, but I can't find it. But it's certainly the lab-based scenarios, was like Skills Boost, I'll probably say, or if you've got a subscription to another provider that offer labs, I tend to learn by doing.
yeah.
When I'm researching, maybe I'll read through some of the documentation for any changes. But practice makes permanent. That's a kind of one of my little phrases I use. But certainly the lab-based challenges are really helpful. But for
I'd definitely agree with that. I think the exam is written to test if you've done this stuff and you know it from doing it. So the best way to practice is not to go through practice exams, but it is actually to go through the labs and challenger labs and things like that to give you the practice. I think I mentioned earlier, there are practice questions. They don't call them practice questions, actually. They call them example content on the Google Cloud website. And it can be sometimes helpful.
Accuracy sort of check.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's more like, have a look at those to kind of gauge whether or not you're ready to take the exam. But I wouldn't recommend using sets of practice questions as a way to learn. And that's partly as well because, anyone, including us who are not Google, it's just an educated guess on if we're covering the content that's actually going to be in the exam, because no one knows that except Google. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, practice by doing, maybe use the Google practice content to gauge whether you're ready. We've got a little bit over time, but there's one final question which I wanted to ask you, Ferris, which is something we get asked a lot, which is it worth doing this one? If you're going to do the professional cloud architect, is it worth just jumping straight to PCA, or is it worth doing this one first? I'm curious what your thoughts on that one are.
I get asked this one as well, and again, depends on your job role, because if you are potentially coming from maybe another provider, you well experienced potentially, and you're already maybe in more of a decision making role. The architect one you might want to jump into. What I think is really interesting is this: it's not an easier version of the architect or a junior exam or anything like that. It still holds clout. Like it's not an easy exam. It's a different exam. It's very much, they are role based, perspective based from an engineer. You wouldn't be as an engineer get asked case studies and architectural design, where the architect exam is 10 miles wide, 2 inches deep. You need to know enough to make a decision why you might then ask an engineer to implement this particular service or piece of infrastructure. I think it carries really well 50%. Not saying that there's no engineering sort of aspect to the architect. There certainly is. I use this engineer one as maybe more of a confidence booster. I would check that for me personally. Getting started is a Google Cloud. Make myself more familiar with the exam. I didn't have the additional sort of, I wasn't in an architectural sort of design role back then, so the case studies did add a little bit more sort of, a little bit more sort of weight to the architect's sort of exam experience maybe. So I certainly use the engineer as more of a get my eye in sort of experience builder, confidence builder for the architect. But they are, it's certainly not an easier junior exam. It's certainly, I'd say, carries 50% into the architect for sure.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Nice validation of day-to-day engineering.
That's it, isn't it? They're very different roles, and I think going right back to what we were saying at the beginning about the value of having these certifications, if you think about the role you're going for, if you're going for a platform engineering role, a DevOps role, these aren't necessarily architectural roles. You're probably working in a collaborative team as an engineer, but you might not be architecting. You might just be building, implementing, operating, supporting. So it's which exam is right for the role that's right for you, I guess. Cool. Well, we are over time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But thank you everyone for joining. Please do have a look at our website, learn.codia.com, to take a look at some of the other free sessions we've got coming up. We do have a session coming up in a couple of weeks on the Professional Cloud Architect exam, if you're looking at taking that one instead. We're also running lots of free training sessions covering all kinds of Google Cloud topics. And those free training sessions also include free access to real environments and hands-on labs. So hopefully you can join us for those. But I think we'll close it there. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you see you next time. Have a good day.